Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Can you kindly confirm you can hear me?
Yes, confirmed.
Great, Amanda. Just I'm waiting for the rest to join and we can start.
Yes, Professor.
Yalla, Rashad. Okay, good afternoon. So to continue what we've been talking about this week, we were talking about the Lebanese Civil War, and we went over the number of schools which interpret and try to explain what happened in 1975. Many of you saw the similarities of what we are having at the moment, and we did go through how AUB had been radicalized. So today we have a very special guest joining us. He is Dr. Fadlo Khuri, our president, and he will be talking to us today, and he will be also interacting with us. However, we will be also conducting the class as usual. So we'll have our discussion and as well as our presentation. And from there, you can ask the president any question you like, but most importantly, we will try to figure out, based on what Joseph Shami talks and titles the investigation into the reasons of the Civil War. So thus far, we have been exposed to what Farid al-Khazin says about the breakdown of the state in Lebanon by blaming the Lebanese left as well as the PLO for basically overburdening the Lebanese state. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Hello. It's a pleasure to be with you today. It's a break from begging for money and for making administrative decisions at the end of the year to keep the campus going. Keep the year.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you for joining us today. So, first of all, I'll open the floor for President Khuri to talk to you, and then we can take it from there. We will run the class as usual for an hour and 15 minutes, or maybe we have until 4:45.
So good afternoon, and thank you for this opportunity, Makram. I appreciate it. I'm used to seeing our students. So I'm going to frame it from the perspective of where I was in 1975 and what I've learned over the last 45 years. So in 1975, I was in the last quarter of first intermediate in IC, and we were in Mishrif. And many of us were not as politically curious, perhaps, as others. I, for one, didn't know about the existence of many of these parties. I knew about the PLO. I knew about some of our more famous politicians, but what they stood for was the least of my interest as an 11-year-old. One day, while we were coming back from Mishrif, the day after the famous bus incident that you've all heard about, we were stopped in traffic for a couple of hours, went home, were told of the incident by our parents, and then the next day, the classes were closed and we would not go back to class for at least 7 months. And what happened, what set off the war, and I can comment on it later, I've learned over the years is much more complex than any one party. Just as the situation we're facing today, of course, I'm not a historian. I'm not a historian like Makram or a political scientist, simply a citizen who observed things at the time has had the opportunity to reflect on it. But one of the things that I've learned the hard way from as a scientist is when something eventually falls apart, it's usually more complex. It's multifactorial. And so we can discuss these arguments about one factor or another contributing to or triggering the Lebanese Civil War. We know about one incident that triggered the World War I.
Sure.
We may know about an incident that triggered this war, right, Makram?
Sure.
But it was far more complex than the Palestinian presence.
Walid Khalidi calls the bus incident, which happened on April 13 of 1975, he calls it the Sarajevo of the Lebanese Civil War. But however, everyone knows, anyone who is slightly familiar with the history of World War I, knows that the assassination of the Archduke was the kind of the spark or the detonator to the war. The actual powder keg, we have been reading about it since we started reading about Fakhreddin, right? We spoke about the power sharing formula. We spoke about the Maronite Druze story, which was later on joined by the Sunnis and the Shiites. And now we see right versus left. And more importantly, we had something happening called the Cold War, which is happening nowadays under a different type of, at least Lebanon is being subjected to a new type of Cold War between Iran or between the US. However, AUB was strategically placed in the sense that although we were part of what we call the Arab nationalist current, AUB in itself was a mirror of the Arab world, more or less. We had the PLO here, we had the PFLP, and we also had the right-wing political establishment in a way controlling AUB for the idea that they were here controlling the country as well as AUB.
So this is something that's, I think, worth all of your thinking about, is AUB as a reflection today as it was then of the wider society. So to echo Makram's point, by 1975, AUB had already had almost 4 years, as I read your book, close to 5 of real campus unrest. The class of 69 protesting when the government of 4 was unable to prevent Lebanon from having the airport bombed by the Israelis.
We talked about it last time.
Right? And the undercurrents at the university, I can speak as someone who grew up in this part of town, were very tense. I had learned how to ride my bicycle in 1970, 71 around the Green Oval, back when that was permitted. By 73, 74, even those of us at IC knew that AUB was becoming a political hotbed. And just to frame AUB and where it was then, at the time, about 55% of the students were non-Lebanese. 45% of the students were Lebanese, but the dominant political currents, as Makram so appropriately pointed out, the sort of, we'll call it the leftist Palestinian Socialist Other Alliance, and the Lebanese, Lebanese.
The pro-establishment and the anti-establishment.
Exactly. Yeah. And clashes were not armed, but clashes were on campus.
Sure. I did write a book on the student movement in Lebanon, and the radicalization of political activism in general, as we read in Betty Anderson's article, was not only restricted to Lebanon, right? We spoke about May 1968, and ultimately also we had something called the New Left, the Trotskyites, the Maoists, the people who were no longer, now we are celebrating, I think, the birth of Lenin, the 150th year of the birth of Lenin. People no longer wanted to put pictures of Marx and Lenin, but they wanted Guevara and they wanted Mao Zedong. So we had a new brand of left-wing activism, as well as we had a new breed of right-wing political activism. People who were supportive of the National Pact, people like Sham'oun, people like Pierre Jmeil. We had a new breed of what I call the 1958 generation, which, be it Muslim or Christian, did not see that the National Pact, which we read about, is viable. You can no longer run this country based on the National Pact that was put together by both of Fadlo Khuri and Riyad Salah. This is something which we will be reading about, and here I'm mentioning the rise of Bashir Jmeil, as well as the rise of people like Walid Jumlat and such quote-unquote warlords who politicians turned warlords.
So very important to remember that, as in many parts of the world, the alliances were shifting. So the alliances of 1958, Rashid Karami, Fuad Shahab,
yes,
Kamal Jumblat, by 1970, those had started to fracture. And you can even look at the sort of forced marriages, political mixed marriages, right of center Christian, ultimately warlords, with left of center Christian warlords, right?
True.
And mixtures of different sects. And these started to be reflected on campus, and they started to seed the tension in society, a society that already had seen a cataclysmic defeat in 1967 for the Arab world. For years here, people were talking about the ease with which the Arab armies would eventually recapture Jerusalem. That destroyed that belief, that myth, as we found out Israel was far more powerful militarily than it had ever led on. The alliances at the highest level, US and Soviet, were fluid. They tended to side ultimately whichever way their interests went. And also that this was an area of campus radicalism. So as a child in the US, as a kindergarten kid, I remember the high schoolers marching through, protesting the Vietnam War in the 1960s, chanting, hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today? In fact, growing up, I was far more concerned about being drafted as an American citizen and dying in Vietnam and never being found than having a rocket accidentally hit me as I walked in the streets of Beirut. So that's the era that we're talking about, a very, very radical, very heartfelt, passionate era, an era where people were certain they had the right solutions, from Lenin and beyond, but also an era in which a very complex country in Lebanon starts to unravel slowly and then explodes all at once in 1975.
Another reason why I wanted Dr. Khuri to speak to us is basically when we talk about the Civil War, Lebanon and AUB was at a much riskier place. It was more dangerous, more volatile. Actually, the institution back then was at risk of closing. So when you hear people saying that this coronavirus and this economic meltdown is a threat to Lebanon, certainly it is, and to AUB, but we will be able to conquer this simply because of the diversity of our student body and the diversity of our faculty as well as staff, and the fact that we can still interact over. Now we'll be interacting through distance learning, but eventually we'll come back and we will have to work harder in order to weather through this storm. And this is where I want to start by actually the people who are supposed to read. Let's start by talking about the reasons which Joseph Shami gives to us. So who's supposed to read? I know Salah is supposed to, and other. Okay, Lara, can you kindly start the conversation?
Okay, sure. So the premise of the article is basically Joseph Shami states that there were many causes, major causes and like smaller causes underlying the Civil War, but they're obscured by violence and the ambiguities of the time. So he uses recent history in order to properly understand the situation. It was written in 1977, so it was during the Civil War that he wrote this.
So Lara, you know, we refer to this as the 2-year war because people assumed that the war was over in 77. And
yeah.
It lasted until 1990.
Exactly.
Go ahead.
So he starts by giving an overview of the recent history, which we already covered in the class, so I'm not going to go over that, but he starts with an overview of the conflicts leading up to the war. So there are 4 major conflicts that he covers. So the first one is the start of 1975, which was the Lebanese government's non-response to the Israeli attacks on a Palestinian refugee camp and a southern Lebanese village. And this led to extreme tensions, like in the political scene. He also mentions a Fisherman Strike in February, which I thought was extremely interesting. And it was triggered by the attempt of a large private corporation to dominate the fishing in...
and here we are referring to the company called Protein, which was partly owned by Camille Chamoun. And we were actually discussing this as part of Salim Nasser's article because ultimately fishermen are part of the agricultural setup. So the inability of the government to take care of the peripheries made people leave their villages and settle around the what we call the belt of misery. Traditionally, if you go to the States, the suburbs are where wealthy people live. In Lebanon, now we no longer have the belt of misery that Salim Nasser talks about. So what you refer to as the Saida incident, ultimately, Lara, the Maruf Saad was assassinated in Saida at this particular demonstration. And the war would have started back then had it not, there was a kind of compromise because the prime minister at the time, Rashid Salah, was considered to be a pro-Kamal Jumlat element. And he ultimately appeased the street in Saida who was pro-Nasserite and pro-leftist and pro-Palestinian.
Yeah, I think so. This idea of the neighborhood, as the French would call it, the banlieue, is dramatically different in Europe and in Lebanon than it is in the US. In the US, exactly as Makram says, it is where the wealthier people go to keep their kids away from those of us who are in the city. They tend to be less diverse than the city. They tend to be more affluent than the city. That's the opposite of the model here in Lebanon, where you see the outskirts dominated by people who are forced to come out of their natural habitat, their home. Why? Either because of carefully targeted violence from the Israelis, who very deliberately figured out that targeting poor southern towns was the best way to alienate the Palestinians from their natural allies, and from a government strategy that from the inception of the Grand Liban did not create a safety net around the people in the rural areas and in the working classes. So it was really very much a creation of a nation of traders and merchants, as the West likes to stereotype this nation. So this was very much a surprise, I think, at the time to people, that the war did not start after the Protein incident, because it was a classic confrontation between right and left. Rumors at the time flew out that it was an army sniper who had killed Maruf Saad, the Nasserist mayor of Saida, under the orders of the army commander, who was known to be somewhat sympathetic to Camille Chamoun.
Yes, Laura, continue, please. Any questions? Do you have any questions for us, guys? Any comments, any questions? Okay, Laura, go ahead, please.
Okay, so the next two events that he talks about are the events of April 13, which I think are the most famous out of all of these, which is when a member of the Phalangists was killed in a Christian neighborhood, and then the death was blamed on the Palestinians, and then a passing bus was loaded with Palestinians and Lebanese sympathizers was machine gunned by the Phalangists. So this was, I think this is like seen as the turning point, or like the main spark of the Civil War. That this also led to a chain of events where like the Muslim prime minister resigned and the president appointed a military cabinet, and this all caused some political difficulties and tensions as well. After he goes over these events, he goes into three major causes. So the first one is that he like identifies as a major cause is the political differences between the warring factions. So I thought it was interesting how the author showed that like connected sectarianism with like social factors and economic factors to show that the war was more than just about like sectarian differences. It was also a war like how both of you mentioned earlier. It was left versus right.
If we go back to what we studied in 1840 and 1860, although the Druze and the Maronites were fighting each other, we fully understand that they were not fighting over religious reasons, right? The Bashir Jumlat and the Bashir Shahab feud, and later on the 1860 showdown between the Druze and the Maronites, had nothing to do with how the Maronites prayed or what the Druze held sacred. They were fighting over power. And the Druze were not accepting the fact that their numerical numbers do not permit them to stay in power, and the fact that the French now had an edge over the rest because simply they had a good relationship with the Ottoman Sultan. So this is how I want you to be able to jump back and forth and try to understand the progression of the confrontation. It is always about factionalism and about political parties competing, but the different names change. I'm not suggesting any type of cyclical nature of history, but we always need to pay attention to this line which makes us able to analyze Lebanese history. Anyone who wants to suggest a single cause explanation cannot argue with us. We have been reading a lot about Lebanese history, and as a doctor, a medical doctor, Dr. Khuri can tell us, you cannot just blame it on one factor, right?
Absolutely. I mean, this is a very complex war. And as I said in my inauguration in 2016, the war really never ended, right? Because many of us, including those of us who had long since ceased to believe that these individuals were truly fighting for the causes they publicly espoused. I think it was an eye-opener for the Lebanese who could watch TV when Lausanne happened in 1983, to see these supposed hated adversaries hand in hand going to dinner in a posh Swiss restaurants while people were slaughtering each other in Mount Lebanon. It was never, I agree completely with Makram, even in 1840s, it was never remotely as simple as a sectarian war. It was a war for power and influence, and so was this war in 1975.
Any questions, guys? Okay, any comments, questions before Lara continues? Please, Lara, تفضلي.
Yeah, so I think building on what was just said, like I noticed, especially in this reading, how it was very much like about power, because Joseph Shami stated several times how it wasn't purely like one sect versus another. Like there were sometimes like people from different sects combined in one political party just because their interests aligned. So he, in the first major cause, he says that there were right-wing traditionalists versus the progressive combatants. So the right-wing traditionalists were the Lebanese forces, the Phalange Party, and among others. And it was overwhelmingly Maronites and Christians, but it also contained a minority of Muslims who found common interest with the dominant Christian community. So this faction argued for a continuation of the existing political arrangements, which is why they were called traditionalists. They wanted to stick to the tradition, whereas the other group, the progressive combatants, which was made up of Lebanese progressives, also Christian and Muslim, they formed a loose working alliances, and they believed in change, which is why they were called like progressives. Like they wanted to change the existing Lebanese political system, and argued for greater participation of Muslims in the government and the military.
Again,
so that
one has to keep in mind that the radicalization of the left was also met with the radicalization of the right. And we had now what we call the Lebanese front, which is as you, Lara, termed it, the traditionalist, and the anti-establishment faction of the Lebanese nationalist movement under Kamal Jumlat. They were basically asking for reform. And ultimately, we grew up, at least the Lebanese here amongst us, who were born after 1990, there is equality in the constitution at the moment, basically. The Taif agreement, as we will be reading in the next week, gave equality to theoretically to citizens. The 1943 National Pact did not give equality. You had first-class citizens, and here I'm not talking about the Maronites. If you were a member of the political Maronite establishment, even if you were a Protestant or a Shiite, you had the same privileges as a Maronite from Sharri, for example. So here we are talking about the peripheries not finding themselves as part of this institution, which we call Lebanon, and this is why they were so enthusiastic about destroying it. This is why they were willing to fight and destroy and ultimately say that, no, we are not Lebanese, we are Arab. And this is where we had the counter-reaction by the Christians saying, no, we are not Arab, we are Phoenician, and using Charles Urim and the Neo-Phoenicians as a weapon in the war. And this is what Kamal Salibi calls the war over Lebanese history. This is chapter 8 of his book, which I invited you all to read.
No, I mean, I think right now, if you're paying attention to what's happening in the United States, you're seeing a war over modern American history. It's been brewing for a while, whether it's how people are reframing the American Civil War. Why did the South fight so viciously, not just to hang on to their way of life, to keep slavery, to hang on to their economy? Why did the North fight so hard? Not just for nobility to free the slaves. Yes, that was a big part of it, but they were fighting to keep the states united and to impose their way of living, which was one man, one vote, including African Americans. So, and yet, why did that shift in the way that whole war was remembered because in the 1920s and 1930s and 1940s, the dominant American historians were Southerners, and they recalibrated and re-imaged Lincoln in a far more sinister mode. So rather than being the person who fought to keep America united and fought to free people, Lincoln became a destroyer of a way of life, of a more European, quote unquote, way of life, even though, as we all know, Britain and others were opposed to slavery. Britain was the ally of the South during the American Civil War. So one of the most important struggles, which is also happening now in Lebanon and in America, is the struggle for history, for the telling of history.
Any questions, guys? Okay, Lara, you have anything to add, or I give the floor to Lana and Salah?
I don't really have much to add. I mean, there's a lot of other stuff to unpack in the reading, but maybe someone else would like
I can continue from here.
Yes, of course, Lana. Go ahead.
Okay, so Laura covered the major contributors to that sparked the Civil War. These are very important, but there's a big section which covers like other contributing factors. But he labels them as like secondary, but I think that they're like more than major, because they still translate with like certain groups of people in Lebanon today, and even like on a larger context in the politics of the region. For example, first he talks about how the presence of Palestinian refugees in large numbers was considered a threat to Lebanon by the right wing. And we can still see this like prevalent today's discourse. So they saw this Palestinian presence as like a catalyst to the left wing. Like it's like they're instigating like some sort of revolution or backlash to the government. But not only about the Palestinians, it was also about the economically and socially depressed groups. So they had this right wing had a fear of Lebanon being caught in the crossfire between the Palestinians and the Israelis, and it resulted in actually more Lebanese deaths than the Palestinians, as the author phrases it. So they wanted to avoid any.
I will be sharing with you a database about the casualties of the Lebanese Civil War. This is something done by an NGO called Lebanon Renaissance Foundation. The numbers of Muslims killed by Muslims and the numbers of Christians killed by Christians are far more than the numbers by Christians killed by Muslims and vice versa. It was not a civil war in the sense Muslim against Christian. It was a war for power. After 1982, it was no longer a civil war, but it was many civil wars, and the militias started carving out their own districts, and it became worse and worse, especially when the Israelis no longer wanted to stay in Beirut, and they left the Druze and the Maronites to duke it out in the mountain, and we had many difficulties, especially we had the Syrian element, which we will be talking about next week as well. Any questions? Continue, Lana.
Okay, so this was like the first part of the confrontation. The second part was the left wing, or they were considered like more progressive parties which supported the Palestinian cause, but not only politically, which was like secularism. They also shared like many social, economic, and geographic traits. So a census showed that at some point in the poverty belt, or like the refugee camps, there was even more Shias than Palestinians. And there was something interesting that one of my colleagues actually, she was doing in her final year project. It's about how there's a large group of people in Lebanon reside now in the suburbs of Beirut rather than their actual place of origin, or in the place which they work in, which is in the city. So they have to commute there. It's because they probably can't, there's like not enough space for all of these people, or it's because of they can't afford to live there because of the economic system. So the effects of this migration that happened during the war, not only the migration, like the bombings and the displacement, it is very well reflected today in the urban distribution of the Lebanese population.
Just to answer Jana Abu Ayash, she texted us here saying that if people within the same faction were killing each other, how come it took such a sectarian face? These ideals that still last until today among the youth. Growing up in West Beirut, it was uncouth and uncivilized to use sectarian lingo. We did not. Now, for example, people talk about Sunnis, Shiites, talk about Maronites, Orthodox. We never refer to this. In essence, the struggle was ideological. So even if Kamal Jumlat was the leader of the Druze, he always spoke about progressive socialism and also about the Nasserite faction. And also Bashir Jmail himself never spoke about the Christians as Christians. He talked about Lebanese. And ultimately, this is what made the civil war, in a way, it was ideological in essence. But bottom line, it's very easy, especially for people to dismiss that everything is happening here is sectarian. Sectarianism, just like the Marxist school or the PLO Cairo Accord explanation, does not suffice on its own to explain what was happening in Lebanon.
Yeah, I think these are facts. So if you think about the massacres in Sabra and Shatila, which were unquestionably committed by the Lebanese forces with the full complicity and planning of the Israelis, I think this is now historical fact. But 2 years later, 2.5 years later, similar slaughters were carried out by some co-religionists from the Amal faction. So we have to remember that there was a lot, also in the late 80s, of total slaughter between the Lebanese forces and the Christian-led element of the army that was led then by General Michel Aoun, the current president of the Republic. So bloodletting tended to be everywhere, okay? And it was the only common theme. And certainly, we can't say there was no sectarian element. Of course there was a sectarian element. But it was about, ultimately, what it was about was power and influence, and sadly also money.
Sure, always about money, always follow the money. It was about, first of all, remember that the Civil War allowed these militias to set up their own civil administrations. They were taxing people, and ultimately everyone had his own port. They could import stuff and they could sell it, and you had to pay contributions. If you were part of the cause, you had to pay. Even if you did not fight and actually train, you were bankrolling the Civil War in one way or another.
In fact, in 1983, if I'm not mistaken, Makram, the single most bloody battles between Palestinians were triggered by pro-Syrian Palestinians against anti-Syrian Palestinians, and this had happened previously in 1976, Sa'iqa and Fatah.
Of course, and we're talking about Tripoli and what would later happen in Tripoli.
Excuse me?
Yes, Amanda, go ahead.
Isn't it almost a fact also that the war wouldn't have been prolonged or protracted to such an extent if it wasn't exactly for what you were saying, that it was super profitable for a lot of people to keep the war going, especially inside the militias, that people made the system, the militias made themselves necessary in the sense that the government had more or less lost its power and the militias were the only ones to go to. So they made themselves necessary, and thus they made the war necessary.
Of course, now if we take the same logic against the coronavirus, the different communities and the political parties are trying to convince us that political parties are the ones that will protect you and protect you against corona rather than the state. So this decentralized system in Lebanon allowed for these people to actually propagate this conflict, which ultimately they were competing over power. And basically, when you feel that there's an existential threat against you, and I would like to draw your attention to the people who carried arms with Lebanese forces, and I will be inviting Dr. Fuad Abu Nader to join us and to give us his own experience. Fuad is a graduate of AUB. Fadi Frame is an engineer from AUB. These people were not poor Christians who were forced to carry arms. These are educated people. They are people who understand how the system works, but still they felt that their physical existence is under threat, and thus they were forced to fight. And this also applies to the communists. We will also be hosting Ziad Saab, who, as I told you, he's originally from Rashaya, but he had to migrate and settle in Nab'a. And it's a textbook communist story about how he wanted to destroy the system, the Lebanese system. He alienated him to the extent that and he carried arms, he was 15 years old. And this is very interesting to keep in mind.
So, Makram, if I could, Amanda just made a very good point. She inferred a point, and Makram brought it home. What was the thing that unified the right and the left of every faction? They all wanted to destroy the state. And the reality is between 1958 and 1967, 68, maybe even 69, the state had become very powerful, at least particularly under Fuad Shahab. They used surveillance to keep things under control. And the state was economically booming, but it was not dissimilar to what you see today in Singapore, a country that we now think of as a model state, right?
Yeah, of course.
Complex, many factions, many sects, minimal violence. They dealt with coronavirus very well, but pretty much a state run by one party.
Autocratic,
right? And Lebanon was there, and Lebanon was actually, the Lebanon of Fuad Shahab was the model for Likosu. When he imagined his Singapore, he visited here repeatedly, and he thought of a state that was highly efficient, made up of people with very diverse backgrounds, but that everything was subjugated to the meaning of the state. The difference, I think he had a longer run out. He had more power. No one faction in Lebanon had any power, which is why 1969 starts the formal attempt to dismember the state's power.
And remember, guys, when we studied the takeover of the Triple Alliance by and Sulaiman Frangieh, systematically they destroyed the Deuxième Bureau, and the Deuxième Bureau knew what was happening in the camps and knew what was happening with every political party. These junior officers, Lahoud and Sami al-Khatib, and these people were in full control of Lebanon. And in addition, during the Lebanese Civil War from 1975 until 1990, the state actually did function. We had, my dad is a retired judge now. He used to go to work, and they used to keep track of all the crimes. Everything that was committed in Lebanon, they had it on record. But in 1990, they passed an amnesty law, which let all the people off the hook, right? So remember that the state, although it was under a lot of pressure and they tried to destroy it, it still survived the civil war. The thing is, will it survive the corona and the economic meltdown? This is something which we will have to observe and to try to figure out. Any questions?
I have a question about what you said.
Yes.
When you're referring to the state, you mean like the Lebanese government, but wasn't it at that time more right than it was neutral? And, you know, how do you mean? You know, they were both.
Well, it was definitely. It always answered to the Maronite president, but also we had Muslims in government, and we had basically people who were loyal to the idea of the state, not to the president himself. So you had Sunni, Druze, Protestant, Greek Orthodox military officers who cared about the cedar tree, the cedar emblem, right? So the idea of the state did exist. We had the police force. People used to be scared from what we call al-Firqa al-Sattash. People used to actually fear being stopped by these people. The idea of again, it is the moral idea of the state rather than the actual weapons, right? So the state did exist. At least my dad always got paid his salary on time. The Lebanese state, first of all, was leaner than this. We didn't have a lot of people in government. And more importantly, we had money coming from abroad. The Gulf states were still pumping money. Libya, Iraq, Syria, the PLO, again, employed a lot of people. We had a lot of people that came to AUB here on PLO money, and we had something called the Palestinian, what's it called, the fund to educate the Palestinians. People used to get educated on this, and we had the UNRWA as well, paying the way of these Palestinian students. So this is the idea that the state did exist in the war.
Let's go back, if we could, for a minute, and I don't mean to interrupt. Let's go back to the group that created the alliance for the most successful run of the Lebanese state, which I think is probably the decade between mid to late 50s all the way to 67, 68, maybe 1 year after the first major Arab-Israeli war in 1967. They included people who you would consider classically left, Kamal Jumblat, of course, it's difficult to define Fuad Shahab except as a centrist and an army commander and sort of process person. And then Rashid Karami, although he was the son of the Mufti of Tripoli and a devout man himself, it's hard to characterize him as right or left. He was left sometimes, right sometimes. He was very much a man of the institution, a man of the state. In fact, arguably
which we call the Nahj. We had the Nahj, right? So you had to be a Nahjist. And ultimately, Ilyas Sarkis, who was elected during the war, was himself the poster child for the Nahj. But ultimately, he, at a certain stage, he gave up on the actual National Pact, because simply the National Pact cannot survive without Lebanon's full neutrality. This is something which brings us back to our current predicament, that for us to be able to function properly, Lebanon has to disassociate itself from everything around it, particularly when it involves a kind of a polarized system. Any questions?
Professor, how do you expect Lebanon in today to become on neither side of the Cold War that we are seeing in Arabs, especially now with the economy? Where would the money come if we were on the sidelines of every battle and every war that is going on?
Well, Mario, if we go back to what we read, the idea that the people who put together the state in 1943, the consortium of the Michel Chiha and the Henri Pharaon, they understood well that you cannot be part of the East-West controversy. Simply because if you want to, mind you, I have no problem abandoning neutrality if we go towards a new economic model. You cannot have a liberal banking system and pick fights with the people around you. If you have, like in Turkey, for example, you have a Turkish industry, you have agriculture, you can actually pick a fight with Trump and with the Gulf and whatever you wanted. But for Lebanon, if you want to focus on the service sector, like Salim Nasser's article explored, you cannot be part of this confrontation. We can come back to this and I don't know, sir, if you have.
Yeah, no, I feel that, Lebanon was not constructed as a state that would be industrially or agriculturally or financially self-sufficient. It was constructed as a state at the heart of which was the service industry, be it tourism, money and banking, education, health. It was all about services. And in fact, industry and agriculture were discouraged actively in the first case and under-supported in the second case. If you think of a country with Lebanon's natural water resources, whether it's the interventions of the Israelis or otherwise, Lebanon was not developed as a feasible agricultural state. But going to the concept of neutrality, and let's focus for a minute on the university. One thing that happens that's not widely reported in 75, 76, of course, that Makram alluded to in the beginning, is that the university has only two revenue streams. Student fees, which have been fought over for 5 years, 6 years almost, since 69, right? And medical revenues. And with the hospital only getting trauma, the university essentially goes bankrupt. The president of the university then, Kirkwood, and the chair of the board, Malcolm Page, Howard Page, they write letters of release for the entire tenured faculty. Those letters were never sent. And they reach out to who? To the Prime Minister of Lebanon, Rashid Karami, who gives Lebanon an 18 million pound, at the time almost $6 million.
Loan.
Yeah, loan, which AUB repays by 1979. So AUB tries to be neutral, is neutral, and becomes the entity that, just as I hate to compare us to some of the big banks that Bush felt were too big to fail, but the state recognizes in the person of I think, in my opinion, a true statesman of Lebanon, a very wise Prime Minister, Rashid Karami, with all hell breaking loose. He says, we can't let the university go under, we're gonna lend them money. Think of that context versus now, because I think it's important to recognize that we don't need the university to lend us money, even though, the government to lend us money, even though we're all in a global economic meltdown. But also think of the fact that here it is, 1976, 75, 76, there's war, there's blood everywhere, and yet the state is still mobile enough, as Makram is saying, still capable enough to keep its greatest university alive.
Yes, Mario, did we answer your question? We can elaborate more as we move forward on our lecture, but I would like to also ask the rest of you, any comments, any stuff to share with us? Lana, are you on?
Yes, I'm back on, but I'm just trying to reconnect from my PC because I lost connection.
Okay, so take your time and continue, please, with the ideas, what you call the secondary factors, which Joseph Shami elaborated on.
Okay, so any changes that happened in the Arab-Israeli conflict, it definitely affected the relationship between the Lebanese and the Palestinians. And whenever things were progressing poorly for the Palestinians, the government would try its best to control the guerrillas even further. Like they would use this as like their moment of weakness to diminish any effect they had on internal Lebanese politics. And as you and Amanda mentioned before, like the economy at that time, it was not booming, but it was like doing better off, like, you know, and what usually happens in states of war, because there was a large amount of money being flushed into the economy. This was done by like many different countries, and they were trying to advance their own national interests, or like
I did mention this, I don't know if I did, but in 1975, there was alarmingly around 70 daily newspapers being published in Beirut. And this is something bad, because every daily newspaper was funded by a faction. And here I'm talking about, like, for example, Libya, the former dictator Gaddafi used to subscribe to a Safir newspaper, although it would arrive to Libya 5 days late. And he would be pumping money and weapons and whatever. This is an indication that for them, Lebanon, as the late Ghassan Touaini used to say, it was a playground, certainly, but the players were Lebanese. You cannot force people to play soccer, right? And I don't know if you've seen the Monty Python skit on the philosophers playing soccer. So here it was also the Lebanese political parties, Kamal Jumla, Pierre Gemayel, and these people who were competing over power, who would score first. Ultimately, everyone lost because the idea of Lebanon would collapse in 1975, or at least not survive. Anyone had anything to add, guys? Yes, Lana, go ahead, please.
Okay, so eventually it goes on saying that the atrocities committed by both sides, actually they prolongated the area. And most massacres that happened, they were actually just like acts of retaliation for previous encounters. So it was just like an endless cycle of bloodshed, even though like it wasn't continuous fighting, but there would be weeks of pure bloodshed from both sides, just trying to.
Not weeks. You would have years of actual peace, quote unquote peace. When I was researching the first time I started researching the archives, you had people going to the beaches. The St. George was open when people were fighting in upper parts of Mount Lebanon and Ain Tura. People were living normally, just like people now are living normally despite the coronavirus. This is how people, and this is alarmingly very bad. When you get used to such a situation, it means that you have a lot of psychological problems. So certainly, it was not 15 years of continuous civil war. We're not talking about the Balkan scenario here or what happens in Sudan. Lebanon, and ultimately we always hear the idea of the conspiracy. Certainly there was a conspiracy, but the conspiracy was not only international. The Lebanese were willing to play along. And at least in some places where the Americans and the Israelis and the Syrians didn't want to go into conflict, the Lebanese wanted to fight. And I'm using the example of the War of the Mountains in 1983. The Israelis, the Syrians, and at least the Americans wanted the Druze and the Maronites to reconcile, but they were not willing to do so because they felt it was now or never. Any questions by the class? Okay, Lana, go ahead, please.
Okay, so he ends the article with like a look towards the future he calls it. he says that Lebanon might not return to what it once was because the damage like incurred, it still resonates today with Lebanese residents, and it's very evident, you know, with the nature of the times that we're living now with the October revolution. But the author he mentions like something here about the bitterness and the hatred that stemmed from these war crimes. He said that it would have an endless effect on Lebanese people. Well, of course it affects us, but there's a different like outlook I see today with people of our age, of our generation. It's a different kind of bitterness than that which our parents have. So, for example, like you mentioned, like, you know, life was at some point was going normal. Like I know from my parents that they had to go to university or attend their classes during that time, and I keep hearing the same phrase, كنا ننزل على الصف تحت القصف. And this is something that's very traumatizing for someone, like, you know, during that age that is trying to build their lives. And we're facing now something that's similar, but like on a very small scale. So
actually, it's, I think, more dangerous than the actual civil war, because one could avoid bullets, but the idea of being helpless, first of all, to the coronavirus, and more importantly for the corruption. What AUB did with the October 17 revolution, this is what AUB stands for. We are here to build a liberal society, a society which is diverse, which can solve problems. It's not bad to fight. And again, wars are usually good, because what comes after the wars is a chance to reconcile. And Salibi, when he wrote his book in 1989, the Lebanese felt Lebanese. The majority of the people felt that Lebanon that they fought for, died for, actually made sense. This is why they were willing to reconcile, in addition to the fact that the Cold War was winding down. And ultimately, there was a new power sharing formula which was brought about by Taif. The Taif is no longer functioning for a number of reasons. The whole world is changing. Again, we are not only, the Lebanese are not immune, and the world is not immune. Populism tends to, it's a cyclical thing. You have the rise of not right-wing populist movements. And here I'm not talking only about Trump and what he says, it's a global phenomena as well as a local phenomena. Sorry, Ed.
No, I mean, I think this, to emphasize the point, Lana and company, your parents say we went there under shelling. And, you know, I was here until 1982, including most of elementary school all the way through the first year of AUB. And I have to say, this may sound stunning, but we loved being here. I moved to New Haven with great trepidation only because I had a younger brother. I moved to Yale, and he was too young for his class. So I wanted to spend a year with him, and then, of course, never moved back here. But we had many, many opportunities, even during the war, in school, public and private schools, to have lives that, despite threats, despite bombs and bullets and other things, these were psychologically fairly healthy for many, not just for the privileged, in that the quality of education in Lebanon, public and private schools, was still excellent. So that meant people had choices. Yes, there were sporadic, very vicious outbreaks of retaliation and war. And they killed people, and many of us lost people we loved and kept scars. But that is not unusual for a civil war. As to what happened after the civil war, people like to say that the Lebanese buried their memories of the Lebanese Civil War, never dealt with it. Well, so did the Spanish. The Spanish, after the end of the Spanish Civil War, which really was a relatively clean war, right? Republicans versus nationalists, left versus right.
Even the French, if they have something called the Vichy syndrome, they just simply don't talk about their collaboration with the Nazis. Yes. So we are not the only nation that decided to bury the hatchet as well as the memories of the conflict.
But the issues, the economic issues, have accelerated and become much more extreme, I would say, now than they were even in the war. And now the opportunities, the economic opportunities, are dramatically less, it seems like, in this country and in dramatically fewer people's hands. So that's one challenge that's quite different. I think most of our generation immigrated, but many stayed. Many of those who immigrated stayed immigrated, some came back. But we worry about whether those opportunities will be there as they should be for your generation, and we hope they will be more abundant, not less abundant. That's if you ask me what my biggest concern is, that's my single biggest concern.
Any comments before Lana goes on? تفضلي Lana. Oh, wait. Jana. How did we get to the situation we are in? This requires a whole week of talk. We can talk about this, but let's listen to Lana wrap up before I'll leave the last 10 minutes for the president to actually, we can open the floor to any question, including to what you just asked us. تفضلي Lana, wrap up, please.
Okay, so another thing, he just talks about details of what he forecasts for the future of Lebanon, like how foreign businesses might be reluctant to return to the post-war Lebanon, and that the partition of the state is highly improbable. And the final point he makes is that the only thing clear here is that there's not going to be any political solution soon which satisfies all major players. And I totally agree with him, because each like group of people, or I phrase it as class of people, regards the situation differently during that time and even now. Like as the president said, sees that there was opportunities for them to continue their normal education per se, but there's a huge part of the population at that time whose voices weren't heard then, and they most certainly aren't heard now. Like there are marginalized groups that don't get what we get today at AUB. It's highly different to be a student in our university than one in public universities or public schools. Like for example, they expect students to do the official exams of the terminal, and they don't get the exact same education that they would be getting if they were at a private school, like most of us were. So it's I don't know.
That's very interesting, and certainly this is a big challenge. At least Lebanese educational level at the time was superior to now, simply because we didn't have private education was restricted to a number of universities. Now we have these small, what I call shops. They're not actually education institutions, unfortunately. And I'm a graduate of the Lebanese University. The Lebanese University graduates great students. But the problem that there's no market for these students to get employed. And the Gulf is it's not only a political problem now, the whole economy, especially, this is a perfect storm what's happening now. Regardless of the coronavirus, the economy of the world, the oil thing, the collapse of the oil economy, what the Saudis and the Russians are doing, this is something that we need to re-examine and to see how we can survive both as a UB and as individuals of a part of this globe as well. Sir, you want to weigh in on this?
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I do think this is an existential moment for Lebanon, for the university, and frankly, for the region. It's not that the region will be erased, and you don't get do-overs in history. You don't get to go back and say, well, I did this wrong, and I did that wrong. This time I'm going to get everything right. What happened post-war can be, I think, the subject of a much longer discussion. But one of the things that happened post-French Revolution is at least some of the root causes were addressed, okay? And opportunities were broadened from just the, what we call the French nobility dramatically by Napoleon.
The émigré.
The émigré, right? So whatever else happened, you know, I wrote an article for The Atlantic, and I took out a line because I knew it would be provocative. I just tossed it in there to irritate my wife. And I said, Lebanon may soon need its Napoleon because otherwise it will surely have its Robespierre. The issue is that the schools, so you go back to the war, and you harped on this point hit it very carefully. The schools in Lebanon, public schools now we're talking, were considered in the top 3 in the world at the time, which is remarkable in science and math, okay? So Lebanon was graduating students who then went on to a very limited number of universities, the American University of Beirut, University Saint-Joseph, the Lebanese University, Haigazian, and the Beirut Arab University. Those were the universities. LAU was still a college. It was a women's college. Then it became Beirut University College. And then I think in the 80s or 90s, it became the Lebanese American University. So you had this choice of 5 universities, of which the Lebanese University was a formidable competitor. Okay, excellent school. People who could not afford it could get a superb education virtually for free. In 1980, my father is dean of the medical school at the American University of Beirut and the father of Nassim Taleb. Nassim Taleb, as the dean of the University Saint-Joseph, sat down and wrote the charter at the request of Ilyas Sarkis, then president of the medical school of the Lebanese University. So there were a limited number of options, and while college was considered aspirational and an important social mobilizer, there was not the dismissal of the other professions that you see today. So master crafts people, right? Agricultural sector and other things. Then I think in the 1990s, there was a reduction in the choices. The formulas seemed to become simpler. Go to college, make money, start a business, immigrate, head west, young woman or young man. And so the fabric of Lebanese society changed to some degree, but more importantly, anything resembling a national compact between nation and people continued to evolve. For me, going back to the Civil War, which is the topic of today's discussion, more important than the factors that started the Civil War were the fact that the Civil War accelerated the phenomenon of Lebanese emigration and disparity of resources that had long been present and that probably more than anything, I think, Makram contributed to the launch of the Lebanese Civil War. The disparity of resources and power struggles which together lit the fuse box.
Anyone has any comments before I open the floor for questions? So now we've finished the actual lecture for today. So I invite you, if you have any questions for President Khuri, any comments in general, any grievances, you can share them openly.
I have a question for both of you, or for the president maybe, but regarding like in my other course, Politics in Lebanon, we discussed very much in depth this whole idea of like the war that hasn't finished yet because there's been no real reconciliation. So my professor in that course is very much talking about it as a yet to finish war. And it was similar, like you mentioned other places, like even in Germany, it took a long time for a truth commission and a real kind of reconciliation to happen. And just for the truth to come out, like people didn't know about Auschwitz in Germany for 20 years, some places. So, but what has the AUB done and what do the educational institutions do to kind of try and bring the negotiation of memory of the war to the table, to the public? Because I also do believe that this is there needs to be a collective memory created for the war to become past, right?
Sure. So I think, first of all, I think there has been a level of reconciliation, certainly between the various power factions. They have personally reconciled a long time ago, right? And I don't think, this idea of sectarian hatred, which was sowed effectively by some of the warlords during the war, I don't feel that that is something that Lebanon has not moved beyond. Maybe not completely, but certainly, as you can see, whether in the people in the streets during October 17 onwards, or in everyday life, this fear of the other has dissipated compared where it might have been during the war. and it points before the war. But there has not been a national memory, in depth, and it has been avoided studiously, including in the history books, including in the textbooks. I often used to go home frustrated and tell my parents during the war, it ended in 1946. The last French soldier leaves Lebanon, and then we live forever in brotherhood and sisterhood and eternal prosperity, peace, love, and the name, in using a title of a song that I loved in the 70s from Elvis Costello, What's So Funny About Peace, Love, and Understanding? So I think if you don't understand what happened, if you don't interrogate it, and if you don't bring it out to talk about it, then it will never fully heal. And that has been a failure. The Spanish got together after Franco and started to look at their history. Their civil war ended in 1939. Franco died in the late 70s, right? King Juan Carlos comes, and even then it takes a while. That's part of it, but part of it is, what's the role of the universities? Well, I think it should be the role of a consortium of universities, including the public university, which is much maligned and politically dominated in its different branches, to have an honest re-exploration of Lebanese history and not just the war.
And here, mind you, when we're interviewed as historians, people want us to talk about the unification of a history book. This is very fascist. I do not endorse having one version or one book which is taught. We are, just like I tell you, you can pick up my course syllabus for free, and I can give you the readings, and you don't have to register. We teach you how to think, how to analyze documents, and how to analyze events. The whole idea here is how to read the experience of human beings and how to learn from them. And this is what AUB and what education institutions do. And ultimately, we want to teach people how to teach Lebanese history, not how, what to teach, how to teach it. I could disagree with you, right, Amanda? We can disagree over a certain event, but it doesn't mean I have to give you an F for disagreeing with me. I can still respect your point of view. And this is what I told you at the beginning. You can disagree with me as long as you back this up by proof. And you can get me a book which I don't like, and you can tell me this is what was written, and you can try to argue. This is what liberal arts education does. This is why we have a lot of engineers here, right? You will never teach history, but when someone over dinner talks about 1975, now you are equipped to actually give a valid argument and to actually learn from the mistakes of the past. And more importantly, to try to understand, or to answer Jana, what went wrong? What happened? Why did we get to 2020? Instead of celebrating the centennial of this country, we are basically trying to find a way out of this quagmire. This is exactly what we are trying to learn out of this. And this is what AUB has always led, has led the way. And more importantly, AUB is responsible for many of the success stories in the region. And this is what we will try to also bank on moving forward.
I mean, I want to go back to, to what I learned after I left Lebanon. So I had the great privilege and misfortune at the same time of coming of age as a physician during the AIDS epidemic. And at a time when we had no good treatments, really. We had one drug called AZT. So I would sit at the bedside and put in IVs in men and women who were dying of AIDS, some of whom had no idea how they got it, some of whom didn't speak English, some of whom weren't sure why they were in the US to begin with, but all of them dying of AIDS. And I learned the importance not just of listening, but of telling people what you believe to be the truth. None of us has a crystal ball so we can tell what is absolute truth, but we can be honest about what we know, and we can be honest about how we learn what we know. I talked about this at graduation, I think 2 years ago, when I talked about what's the most important thing we do at AUB, at the great liberal arts universities in the world. We arm you with the ability to dissect truth from untruth. There should never be one truth, okay? That is faith. That's called faith. That's between you and God in whatever way you view her or him or nature, okay? But you should have the ability to critically get a piece of news or get some data and interrogate it and see how that argument is put together. And if we are unsuccessful in teaching you, in adapting you, in creating the opportunities for you, and you're going to go 60% of the way, we're going to meet you the other 40% of the way, to develop that skill set, then Lebanon has no hope. And I have great hope for Lebanon because I believe, and I'm not just saying this, that this is the generation to acquire that skill set despite the bombardment of social media and of fact and fiction and every type of thing, so that you can arrive at what you believe to be the truth, but also to listen to other people's version of what the truth is.
Any questions, guys?
Professor,
Yes, go ahead, Chloe.
I just wanted to ask, during the October 17 revolution, we saw many people who were kind of speaking out, and they were just tired of the way this history, the history of Lebanon has taken such a sectarian face. And even during the Civil War, we saw many left parties kind of just like deconfessionalize the whole system and the political system of Lebanon. I would like to hear just if you guys think that there's, in the future of Lebanon, a possible power sharing system that does not rely so heavily on the confessional system and very much within this sectarian phase.
I think you know my opinions. My father believed in a secular Lebanon. I believe in a secular Lebanon. I don't believe the sectarian power sharing arrangement, which was a marriage of convenience for a few years, has served the country well. We said it in An-Nahar openly in the issue that I guest edited. I believe that it is now a burden on the country to continue to choose women and men based on what's on their ID card, much less what they truly believe.
To answer you, Chloe, simply yes, we will get there simply because the system is broken. The system can no longer cater for the clientelist favors which worked for the last 2 centuries. And this is why people, if you listen to people, even people who try to defend the system, they are asking for basic human rights, participation, citizenship, and ultimately we might not become Norway or Denmark, but to get there, we need to start by paying taxes. And once you pay taxes, you hold people accountable. And how do you hold people accountable? By having a power sharing formula which allows people, we don't have an opposition and a pro-government and anti-government factions here. They are all on the same table and they are all part of the same boat. And ultimately they know what makes people tick because they've been running the system for so long. Ultimately, the way forward requires people like you to be analytical and to hold people accountable, because when people, again, you have people on TV that we call fact checkers. So anytime, I always dread the fact that saying something in lectures and someone Googles it and he proves me wrong. This is fine. If he proves me wrong, I will correct myself. We need to hold people accountable, starting with me, with President Khuri and everyone around us.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, President.
Anyone else?
Professor, I do have a question for Dr. Fadlo, but it's not related to the course.
Yeah, of course. Fadlo. Sure.
Doctor, it's tuitions. Is there any updates concerning if any increase in tuition, or if it's the dollar to Lebanese ratio in AUB will change?
So I think, you know, Mario, bottom line, there's not going to be a tuition increase. The more challenging, and we'll announce this publicly, the more challenging thing is what we do with the ratios. And in an ideal world, which we don't live in, everyone who can pay the dollar amount because their revenues, as I've said before, the revenues of their parents are paid in dollars, they will do what I think is the honorable thing and pay that rate, and they can prepay if they want. Whereas people whose parents' salaries are paid in Lebanese, their situation is dramatically different. And we have to work with them, be that by increasing their financial aid or coming up with a rate which they're able to pay. Bottom line, I think we've proven that we're a university that's invested in the students we have and the students that we accept. I made a pledge that I don't think any other university president made, which is we will do everything possible to not allow you to drop out for financial or reasons of psychological health. And what we're trying to do is come up with a formula that's flexible that allows people to stay here and finish their education.
It can't be any clearer, right, guys? No one will be left behind. This is something which AUB has always done. Just do well, keep your grades up, because if you show up to any administrator with good grades, he can help you. If you are failing, it'll become harder and harder to get help. Questions? Any more questions, guys?
Professor Khuri, is the summer semester going to be online?
More than likely, because, you know, I think the reality is there's too much we don't know about COVID-19. Now that you're seeing people's serum levels come back up after they've cleared their infection, then suddenly they're showing antibody. Does that mean they're immune? And we're just detecting levels of dead RNA, viral RNA, or are they having a recrudescence of their infection? I honestly think the day of packing 500 people in a room are finished for a long time. I do think, and I hope, we'll have classes in the late summer for the fall semester, but they're not going to be huge classes. And we're going to have to do this very carefully because, frankly, your health and your futures are the most important thing for us. And we just don't know enough about the virus at this point. No one seems to.
And ultimately, although I do miss you and I like interaction in class, we are interacting. I don't think the good thing that my classes, at least, I'm having the dream team because I have the best people joining us from 2 sections. And instead of having a conversation of 20 people, I'm having a conversation of 50 people, which is more and more diversity. And this is something which we will lose if we go back immediately to smaller classes.
The fact that Makram and I are socially distancing but in the same room tells you that I'm optimistic, that with small groups, we are going to be able to connect you to AUB physically, but it's going to have to be gradual and very careful because we do care about you.
Okay, Nadine. Anyone else? The last question, we need to wrap up because the president has another appointment. And I think you might have gotten bored with us.
No. I will say the AUB students and faculty are never boring.
Okay, guys.
Thank you.
Any questions? Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much, President Khuri. Always a pleasure.
Thank you, class.
And I'll be communicating with you about what to read for next Tuesday. Be safe. Take care of yourself. If you have anything for me, we will talk about the counterfactual history assignment over the WhatsApp. If you have any questions, anything you need, just communicate with me over email or over WhatsApp. Have a nice evening, and I'll see you soon.
See you. Take care of yourselves.